Hopefully this presentation will help other hams who are interested in getting into solar power for their ham radio. I had an interesting time in gathering data. My original goal was to run PSK in the field by way of solar power. And I thought it would be an interesting idea to take the laptop out into the field, maybe on top of a mountain or a campsite, and run for a period of about 8 hours off of solar power. I knew nothing about solar power. I only knew that it was expensive. Then it turned into, well, could I do 24/7 in the field? Maybe a field day operations or something of that nature. And then it turned into 24/7. Could I do this at home? And of course the answer was yes. How much money was I willing to spend? And it seemed like it was going to be awfully expensive. Turns out that's not entirely the case. So the research that I did is, of course, I had to go to the internet like everybody else, and I found that there were three different types of people, or three different types of information that I was gathering. And the first was from the arrogant, and it sounds like a negative comment, but it's a fact. There are a lot of experts out there who get frustrated, quite frankly, at some of the questions, because they're repeated, and the people that are asking them don't like the answers. There's also a lot of experts out there that will try to tell you the proper way of doing it. There are many of us that can't afford all that expensive equipment. So then you have the manufacturers, which I call them the thieves, that are not reliable sources. Some of those manufacturer companies are just they're going to try to sell you the most expensive products. And then there's you and I, the amateurs, the techies, the ham radio operators. We love to share information. I don't know of anywhere else in the world where you can find this many people who during a conversation will brag about the equipment that they have. And we don't get offended by it. We're quite honored that you're sharing, and we're in awe of it. We love to brag about it, and we love to hear what other hams are doing, and we ask lots of questions. That's just the nature. So the bottom line is gather your own data. Trust, but verify. And this presentation will show you some of the data that I was gathering. So what questions was I going to ask? Well, I knew that I needed a battery, but what kind of battery did I need? How big did I need the battery? What type of solar panel? What were the different kinds? I was getting very confused at looking at all the different types and different sizes. And there was something called a controller. Obviously I needed one, but didn't really know exactly what it was and what it did. So we start with the battery. You're going to find that everything's rated in amp hours, and obviously that's extremely important because you want a battery large enough to supply enough power, providing that there's no sunlight or very little sunlight. So everything's rated in amp hours. So how big of a battery did I need? I had no clue. And there are also different types. There's lithium and sealed lead acid batteries, or lead acid batteries. Now there's different types of lithium. I won't get into those. That's something that I'm going to explore later, but there's 3 or 4 different types of lithium batteries, and I knew that one of them was dangerous and could catch fire. I also knew that they're a little too expensive for me, but the plus side is they're lightweight, and that's something that I was probably going to need to take it out in the field. But again, my plans kind of expanded into a 24/7 ham radio shack at home, so I'll explore that later. So that leaves us with lead acid batteries, and the most safest was the sealed, the SLAs. The downside is they're big, they're heavy, but they're inexpensive and they're extremely safe. So there's different types of SLAs. There's AGMs and gel cells. I won't go into the details of those, But for this presentation, we're going to concentrate on AGMs. So anything that I say references sealed lead acid, I'm talking about the AGMs. They don't vent, which was a plus. And I knew that my ham shack would probably expand to multiple batteries, called a battery bank. And I wanted to make sure that I didn't have to vent any gases. Also, you want to search on deep cycle batteries and avoid anything that references starting a car or some type of lawn equipment, as these deliver a sharp burst of energy, and they don't perform well over long periods of time. So you're going to be looking for marine type batteries, or just look for deep cycle. So you have to understand the state of the battery, and this was an eye-opener for me. A battery is considered fully charged at 12.8 or 12.7 volts, depending on who you ask. So we know that our radios will start to fail at around 11.7 volts, and the batteries will go dead are considered dead at 10.5, maybe a little bit below that. And I knew that my IC7200 had a plus or minus 15% either side. So that brought me to 11.7. So I needed to make sure that as I was operating, that I wasn't going below 11.7 volts. And if you look at this chart, you can see that as long as I'm keeping at the 60% range, 12.2, 12.1, I should be on the safe side. And that means that there's 60% that you can't use. So that's 40% usable energy. And it's something that I hadn't considered. So looking at the ICOM 7200, and most radios are the same, although some are a little bit more tolerant than others. The manual says that in receive mode it's drawing 2 amps. And at 100 watts it's drawing 22 amps. I haven't been able to verify that. Matter of fact, I turned my backlight on full brightness, turned the volume way up, and at most I could draw 1 amp, but typically it was 0.88 amps, and not the 2 amps advertised. And at 100 watts it was only doing 11.8 at most. So 0.88 and 11.72 amps is what I was looking at. So using that, I can start to do some calculations. So this formula is a combination of various formulas found on the internet. I may have modified some of it. This is widely known. But basically what it says is if you know the percentage of time you're going to be in receive mode and the percentage of time you're going to be in transmit mode and the amps that it's drawing, you should be able to calculate how much amp hour battery you would need. So for example, for most of my calculations I was using 8 hours. So if I know that I'm drawing 0.88 amps in receive mode and 11 amps in transmit, all I need to do is figure out what's the percentage of time I'm going to be in receive and what percentage of time I'm going to be in transmit. And I should be able to calculate. So here's the formula that again, but to put into a real world example. So I use 70-30. The IC7200 draws 0.88 amps. And at 25 watts, it was measuring at 7.43 amps. So using that formula, I can calculate that I needed for an 8-hour operation a 22.76 amp hour battery. But the problem is, I'm only using 40% of the battery before it starts to become classified as in the dangerous state. So I had to use 60%, divide that by 60%, and then I come up with close to a 40 amp hour battery. I don't think they make 40 amp hour batteries, so maybe a 100 amp hour battery I should be fine. So taking some readings, you can see here at 10 watts and 25 watts, let's just say that I'm operating 80-20, 80% in receive, 20% in receive, or excuse me, 80% in receive and 20% in transmit. At 25 watts, I'm going to need a 29.2 amp hour battery. And the same thing, at 50% receive and 50% transmit at 25 watts, I'm going to need a 55 amp hour battery. So 100 amp hour battery should be plenty. Using that same formula, you can look at the 60-40 rule. 60% receive, 40% transmit. And here's the full chart that I took, all the readings from the IC7200. At 100 watts, the very last line, 60% receive, 40% transmit, I would need a 70 amp hour battery. So now I'm still getting close to that 100 amp hour battery. But at the same time, in PSK mode, which is what I was primarily trying to do, I'm going to be operating mainly at 20 watts, 25 maximum. So again, I'm still at below the 50 amp hour battery. So that takes care of the battery. So now the solar panels are a little different. There's basically two different types. I'm sure there's more, but the two I ran across are mono and poly. And I used the mono only because in cloudy conditions, you're pulling in, it seems to be a heck of a lot more efficient. It doesn't need direct sunlight. It's wintertime at the time of this presentation, so I'm pulling in around 13 and 14 volts at 7:30 a.m. in the morning. The sun technically isn't fully over the horizon at that point. There's also the price and the size, and those all are determined by the number of watts. So do I need a 40 or do I need a 100 watt solar panel? I ended up buying a 100 watt because it was about $135 on Amazon. Next is the controller. This was probably the most difficult for me to understand because this is where there's a lot of jargon going around. But in short, there are two different types, PWM and MPPT, which I'll get into in the next couple of slides. But a good controller has three different stages: bulk, absorption, and float. Bulk just means that it gradually rises the voltage up to 14.4 volts, and then it'll kick into what they call an absorption stage, which it stays there for about an hour or so. And then after that, it goes into a float stage where the voltage trickles down to a 13.4 volts. Now remember, a battery is fully charged technically at 12.7 volts. And here's a quick chart of the actual charge state from bulk stage to the float stage. So just to give you an example of what I was experiencing, at 10:30 this morning, my battery was at 12.47 volts. Now I had been operating the day before pretty heavily, all the way into the late hours, well, 9:30 at night. And I was running close to 100 watts, sometimes at 100 watts on sideband. So my battery at that point in the morning was down a little bit, not tremendous amount, about 80% efficiency. So I wanted to turn off the radio so there was no load on it, and I wanted to see how long it would take to fully charge that battery. And you can see that it didn't take long. By noontime, actually it was before noon, it was fully charged. So back to the controllers. Which type of charge controller are you going to need? Well, there's cheap, and then there's MPPT, which it is going to be more expensive, but I highly recommend it, and here's why. You don't get full efficiency with a PWM controller. It's pulse width modulation versus maximum power point tracking. And essentially what it says is it matches the voltage of your, or excuse me, the wattage of your solar panel to your battery. In this example that I give here on the last bulleted point, the MPPT controller would have delivered a full 8 amps to match the 100 watts of power, whereas a PWM would have only matched 75 watts. So you're not going to spend that much more money, but you're going to see these kits out there. And I won't name the companies, but there's different businesses that sell these solar panel kits. Most likely they're inexpensive because they're using PWM. If you're going to spend a little bit of money on this, you might as well get an MPPT controller. So this just shows a very quick and very simple layout of my system, at least what I started off with. 100-watt solar panel, a 20 amp controller connected to the battery, and the radio is connected to the controller. I also put a watt meter in between there. That was something separate. This particular company also sells a separate display. I don't recommend the MT5 tracer controller or display unit. It does not provide accurate information on the amp hours of the battery, the number of amps being drawn, but it's a quick, simple way, an inexpensive way to see how many volts are coming in from the solar panel. So what was the total cost? Well, I'm going to show you two different pieces of information. The first of which is what I actually spent, and then what I could have gotten away with it. First of all, I spent about $149 on the solar panel. This was overkill, but in the long run, I'm probably going to need this anyway because I plan on putting extra batteries in parallel, plan on running the laptop, the lamp, and various other devices here in my shack. Next was the controller. Remember, MPPT controllers are going to be more expensive. You could have gotten this one for about $37, $49. But again, you wouldn't get the efficiency out of it. And then you have the battery. Now this was very interesting. I didn't trust buying anything online at the time. So this 100 amp hour battery, $240, in my opinion, was way too expensive. They're still expensive, but I could have gotten the same deal online with free shipping for about $180. So you really need to do your homework. But given that, I also spent money on extra cables, longer cables. So the total came out to about $523. Now, what I should have done just to get started is settled for a 50 watt, same controller, a 60 amp hour battery. I probably could have gotten a better deal. Probably could have gotten it down to about $110, and the same amount of money for the cables, maybe even a little less on that. So I could have gotten away with well under $500, and that's running the HF rig for a solid 8 hours, maybe even 12 hours, depending on how late I want to go into the night. There's something to consider when you're building your system is take as many readings as possible, and I am a statistic geek. So there's a website called sunearthtools.com, and what you do is you put your location in, and it'll tell you where the sun is relative to your position. It'll tell you show you the elevation and the azimuth. So I started collecting this data and putting it in a spreadsheet, and what I was able to do was to calculate some pretty interesting things. Now, at 9:45 in the morning, maybe about 9:30, the voltage coming in from the solar panel was 14.8 volts. But it didn't take long for it to really shoot up to about 17.2, 17.5, and this is about 9:30 right here, and this is 15 minutes later. So from this point on, I'm pretty much getting 16, 17 volts. And you can see it ended somewhere around there, but again, this is the azimuth, or excuse me, the elevation of the sun. So from 9:45 on a cloudy day, by the way, this was so about 11 o'clock on, it really got very cloudy. I was still pulling in a heck of a lot of volts. Granted, this is wintertime, so the sun isn't going to be directly overhead. It's this is probably the worst case scenario that you can get. It's winter, it's cloudy, and I'm still charging my battery. Remember what I said, that by noontime, my battery was already charged. So that would have been around here. So in this area, it's a terrible drawing. My battery was fully charged. So there's all sorts of websites that I could list here, but the ones that got me started were solarpoweredhamradio.com. Now this gentleman's a ham operator. Gave some great presentation, gave some great links, very good information about how to get started. A little more in depth than what I can provide you. But it gave me the inspiration to do some more homework. Some cool videos are videos by Mike and Craig 3212. Now, videos by Mike, I think he's the one who has himself sitting on a beach in Florida, making all sorts of HF contacts. Very interesting. I think it was under 100 watts, or maybe it was 100 watts sideband, military style antenna, and I think he was using a 60 watt or a 40 watt solar panel, and I'm not even sure the amp hours of the battery, but it was very low. So it can be done. It can be done cheaply. It can be done very effectively. Really cool videos online. I strongly suggest you go to videos by Mike and Craig 3212 and watch those just to get yourself started. And of course, you're welcome to email me with comments or questions. I am by no means an expert. I'm only collecting data. I have lots of spreadsheets that I've created of all the data that I've collected. I'd be happy to share it with anybody that wants to take a look at it. Lots of neat graphs. But in closing, it can be done. It can be done relatively inexpensive. And I plan on doing another presentation once I get the rest of the ham shack up into a 100% state solar powered.